My name is Margaret Collins. I'm a 52-year-old school librarian. And 14 months after I approved my mother's cremation, my heart stopped on a hospital table, and I was shown exactly what that decision cost her soul. I was dead for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. What I saw in those 6 minutes, I have tried to keep to myself. I tried, but I was sent back with a specific reason, and it has to do with a choice that millions of families are making right now, in good faith, with love, without knowing what I know. If you had asked me before any of this happened whether cremation could trap a soul, I would have smiled the way you smile at someone who believes something you've quietly decided is superstition. I'm a librarian. I organize books. I go home to a quiet house. I am not someone who traffics in ancient fears. She stopped calling 2 years ago, my mother. And after she died, I signed the forms she had asked me to sign. I stood at the facility and watched them take her body away. I told myself I was honoring her wishes. I told myself that for 14 months. I was lying on that hospital table when everything I had told myself collapsed. I need you to stay with me. What Jesus showed me in those 6 minutes changes everything you think you know about what happens after the fire. And if you are facing this decision for someone you love, this is the most important thing you will hear today. My mother's name was Eleanor Walsh. She was born Eleanor Collins, married my father at 22, and outlived him by 16 years. By the time she died, she was 78 years old, sharp as she had ever been, and deeply, practically independent in a way that made me both proud and crazy in equal measure. She had been a seamstress for most of her working life. Not the romantic kind you imagine with a thimble and a lamp. She worked in a commercial alteration shop, which meant industrial machines, fluorescent lights, and a back that ached by the time I was in grade school. She retired at 68 and immediately started sewing again out of pure love for it, which I found either beautiful or exasperating depending on the day. What you need to understand about my mother is that she hated excess. She hated waste. She hated taking more than her share of anything: space, resources, attention. When she told me 3 years before she died that she wanted to be cremated, she explained it the way she explained most things, practically and without room for debate. "I don't want to take up space," she said. "A burial plot costs money. A headstone costs money. And then you've got this piece of ground just sitting there taken? No, burn me and put me in the garden. That makes sense." She said it at the kitchen table eating soup. That's how my mother made major decisions. At the kitchen table eating soup. I said, okay, what else could I say? It was her body. It was her choice. I agreed with the logic. Even as something underneath me went quietly, wordlessly still. Have you ever agreed with something out loud, while something deeper in you went completely silent? That was what happened. I noticed it. And then I ignored it. When she died, quickly from a stroke in her sleep, which is how she would have wanted it, I did what she asked. I signed the forms. I drove to the facility. I waited while they processed the paperwork. And when they took her back through the door, a sudden pressure seized my chest in a way that I refused to examine. I had made the right choice. She had asked for this. I told myself that for 14 months. I was still telling myself that when they put me under for the procedure, routine, minor, the kind people have and go home from the same day. My heart stopped at 2:14 in the afternoon. I was gone for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The surgeon later told my sister they had been 30 seconds from losing me entirely. I never made it home that day, not right away. The alarm started before I fully understood what was happening. I heard a change in the room. Voices shifting register, the particular sharpening of sound that tells you something has gone wrong before anyone has said it. I felt my vision do something strange, like a camera losing its lens adjustment. Then there was a sound, like a cord being pulled from the wall. Then nothing. And then I was somewhere else. It wasn't floating above my body the way people describe in movies. The cinematic ascent, the looking down at yourself on the table. It was nothing like that. It was instantaneous and absolute, like a note cut off mid-measure. One moment I was in the hospital room with its fluorescent hum and antiseptic smell, and then I was somewhere that had none of those things. No smell, no sound, no orientation. I was simply elsewhere. The space I found myself in is the hardest thing to describe because every word I have for it comes from a physical world that didn't apply there. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't bright. It wasn't strictly fog, but there was a presence that functioned like it. A layered, muffled quality to the space that made it feel enormous and close at the same time. I couldn't see edges. I couldn't determine direction. I knew I was present, intensely present, more awake than I had ever been in my life. But I had no landmarks. And I was not alone. I couldn't see them clearly. There were others in that space. I was certain of it. But they appeared the way shapes appear through thick glass. Suggestion, not form. Some seemed to be moving. Some seemed to be waiting. Some seemed to be doing something that had no physical analog I could map. I wouldn't call it fear, but I felt what fear might feel like if it were translated into pure sensation. A kind of heightened, unmoored alertness. What I noticed standing there was this. I was not confused because I didn't know I was dead. I knew. With a clarity that surprised me, I knew I had left my body on that table and that my body's condition was uncertain. What confused me was something different. I didn't know which direction to move. The space felt suspended, as if it existed in a gap between something and something else. I stood there, or whatever the equivalent of standing was, and waited. And eventually, not in response to anything I did, not because I called out or asked, something shifted. Not a voice, not a light, a direction, a pull, subtle but unmistakable, like the change in air pressure before a door opens. Something was drawing me forward, or what felt like forward, into a region that was different from where I stood. I moved toward it. There was no reason not to. The transition from the in-between space to what came next is not something I can describe incrementally because it didn't happen that way. I didn't walk toward a light and watch it grow. I simply arrived. One state dissolved into another the way sleep dissolves into waking. Not a journey, but a change. And what I arrived in was warmth. Not temperature, not the kind you feel on skin. Something deeper than that. A warmth that had weight to it, that pressed into me from all directions at once. Color that I don't have adequate words for. Not because it was strange, but because it was more completely itself than color in the physical world ever manages to be. The blue was entirely blue. The gold was entirely gold. There was no dilution. I noticed all of this in the periphery of my awareness because in the center of it was my mother. She was standing perhaps 20 feet from me, I think, in a space that had no furniture, no walls, no reference points except her. She was wearing something pale and simple. She looked exactly as she had looked at 70, before the last years softened her edges. Upright, watchful, immediately herself. She said my name. She said, Maggie. I want to be careful about this part because what happened next is both the easiest thing to describe and the hardest. The reunion itself, the crossing of that space between us, the sound of her voice, the specific reality of her presence, that was not complicated. It was the most direct thing I have ever experienced. She was there. I was there. We had not spoken in 14 months, and now we were speaking. But what she told me was not simple. She was at peace. I want you to hear that first because it matters. Eleanor Walsh, my mother, was not suffering. She was home in whatever way that word means anything in that place. Arrived, settled, herself. She was not frightened, and she was not angry. She spoke to me with the same directness she had used at the kitchen table over soup, practically clearly, without dramatics. She told me that getting there had not been immediate. After the fire, she used that phrase, after the fire, her soul had spent time in a state she described as fragmented and suspended. Not torture. She was clear about that. Not the hell of religious imagery, not punishment, not a wrong destination, but a disorientation so complete, so dense, that it was its own kind of suffering. She said it was like being a book that had been torn apart before anyone finished reading it. The pieces were all present, but they had no coherence. She didn't know which direction led to peace. She didn't know how to orient herself. She wandered, she said, in a state of suspension that lasted long enough to matter. She was past it now. She had arrived where she was meant to arrive. But she looked at me with my mother's eyes and she said, "Someone needs to know this happened." "You're the one who made the decision," she said. not as accusation, as fact. You need to know what it cost. I started to speak, to apologize maybe, or to explain, and she stopped me. There's someone you need to meet, she said. He's been waiting. He was already there. That is the only way I can say it accurately. I did not see him arrive. I did not watch him walk toward me or hear footsteps or observe an entrance. I became aware of his presence the way you become aware in a very quiet room that someone else is breathing. A consciousness that was not mine and was not my mother's and was enormous. I turned, or the equivalent of turning, and he was there. I have tried to describe this to exactly 3 people in 2 years, and I have failed all 3 times, which is part of why I'm doing this instead. He did not look the way paintings look. He did not look the way I had imagined in a lifetime of Sunday mornings. He looked like absolute authority given form, and I say that knowing how inadequate it sounds. There was nothing soft about his presence, and nothing frightening. He was precisely himself in the same way the color gold had been precisely gold. No dilution, no metaphor, just the thing entirely without any of the usually attending qualifications. He said my name. Not Margaret the way my name appears on forms, not Maggie the way my mother says it. He said it in a way that contained everything the name means. Every version of me, every age, every morning, I had woken up wondering if I was doing enough. He said my name the way you'd say the title of a book you had written yourself and knew by heart. And then he said, I know about Eleanor. Not as information, as the beginning of something. He said, I designed the body as a vessel, and I designed its release. He paused. What he said next was not loud, but it was the kind of thing that leaves no room for argument. Not because it is commanded, but because it is simply true in the way that gravity is true. You don't argue with it. You receive it. The separation of soul from body is not instantaneous, Yadi, he said. It follows a process I made with great care. The body, even after life has left it, remains in relationship with the soul for a time. There is a designed release, a gradual loosening. What I made was not a container that simply holds and then discards. What I made was a home that the soul must be released from properly in order to arrive where it is going without fracture. He was not angry. There was no condemnation in what he said, not of my mother, not of me, not of the millions of families who have made this choice in good faith. What he spoke was the grief of a craftsman watching his design, used in a way it was not meant to be used. Not evil, not punishable, but a disruption. A violation of something made with extraordinary care. He said, this has been forgotten. I am not the one who forgot it. Then he said he wanted to show me something. What he showed me I cannot reproduce as a visual description because what I witnessed was not visual in any meaningful sense. It was more like understanding given form, the way in a dream you can know everything about a place without having read a single sign. He showed me the soul's departure from an intact body, gradual, guided, complete. I did not watch it happen to a specific person. I understood it happening, the way it is designed to unfold, the layered process by which the soul disengages from its vessel over the days following physical death. There is a sequence to it. There is a tenderness to it. The body, in that process, is not just a husk, it is still a participant, still in relationship, still providing a kind of anchor from which the soul detaches correctly and completely before moving forward into what it is moving toward. And then he showed me the other thing. What happens when the body is destroyed before that process is complete? I will not call it torture, because he didn't, and because that word carries images that distort rather than clarify. But what I understood, what I felt in the way you feel a door slam shut, was a cord cut before it has finished its work. The soul, mid-process, is severed from its anchor. The disorientation that follows is not a punishment. It is physics. The equivalent of trying to navigate without a compass that has been taken from your hands before you knew where north was. You are not in the wrong place. You are not damned. But you are lost in a way that has consequences. And those consequences take time to resolve. And the time that resolution takes is experienced. Eleanor had experienced it. He let me understand that clearly. What she had described to me. The fragmented suspension, the disorientation after the fire, was not unusual. It was the consistent result of a specific disruption. And then he said something that I have sat with every day for 2 years. This is happening to millions. Not as condemnation of the people who chose it or the families who honored those choices. As a statement of fact about a practice that has become ordinary and a consequence that has been entirely hidden, and a design that the world stopped speaking the language to understand. He looked at me, or what he did that was the equivalent of looking, and he said, "You were not brought here to stay." I did not want to go back. I want to be honest about that. There is no dignified version of this part of the story where I heroically accept the divine commission and prepare to return with noble purpose. What I felt was resistance that was almost physical, a clinging to where I was and what I had found there, including my mother, including the peace of that place, including the unbearable rightness of being in the presence of what was undeniably real. I said, or communicated, in whatever way communication happened there, that I didn't want to leave. He did not argue with me. He was patient in the way that absolute truth is patient, not because it is unsure of itself, but because it has no need to coerce. He said, "You were not brought here to stay. You were brought here to know, and knowing carries responsibility." He told me why I was being sent back, not to argue doctrine, not to condemn anyone, not to stand on a corner with a sign. He told me that the specific reason I was being returned to my body was to tell the truth about what happens, so that people who have not yet made the decision could make it differently. That was the mission. That was the reason for this. And then he told me to go. I went back through something that I can't quite call a door, though door is the closest word I have. A threshold, a passage, a boundary between what I had just been inside and the world I was being asked to return to. And then I was on the table. And the alarms were different. And someone was saying words I gradually understood to be my name. I woke up. That was 2 years ago. I'm still a librarian. I still organize books and help kids find stories and go home to a quiet house on Sunday evenings. My mother's ashes are still in the garden she loved, and the roses she planted 10 years ago bloomed again this spring. I don't carry the guilt I used to carry. What happened to Eleanor happened, and she has arrived somewhere that is perfectly whole, and her suffering is finished. But I cannot unknow what I know, and he was clear that not knowing was no longer available to me. So I'm telling you, if you are making this decision right now, for a parent, a spouse, a child, for yourself, I am asking you to pause. Research what burial has meant across every human culture and every sacred tradition for the entirety of recorded history. Ask why the same answer appears everywhere, across peoples who had no contact with each other. Ask what the body meant to the ancient world that we have decided it no longer means. The answer you find will not be superstition. It will be a nearly universal understanding of something that was known before we decided we were too educated to know it. The body is not just a container. The way it is released matters. My mother's name was Eleanor Walsh. She was a retired seamstress who didn't want to take up space. She made her choice, and I honored it. And she has arrived where she was always going to arrive. But she asked me to tell you what the journey cost. This is me telling you. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life whose memory you're carrying the way I carried Eleanor? Someone whose departure you honored with love and maybe with a question underneath it that you've never let yourself ask out loud? If that question has been living in you, I hope what I've told you today gives it somewhere to land. If this testimony has stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about what it brought up for you. I read everyone. And if you want to hear from others who have stood at that boundary and come back with what they found, subscribe. There are more of us than you think. Eleanor was the reason I went looking for the truth. You don't have to wait for your own reason. You already have hers.